All right, we're going to talk about oogenesis. When you use the term oogenesis or spermatogenesis, we are talking about meiosis. So meiosis, which we discussed in the male reproductive system, again, is a special cell division where you produce gametes. So oogenesis is going to produce the gamete, which we call an egg cell, or basically we could say oogonia, primary oocyte, or ovum, which are all words for egg. Now, when we talk about the sperm cell, spermatogenesis is way different than oogenesis because males can reproduce spermatogonia for life. Now, it's very different for the female. So we do start out with a stem cell called an oogonia, which is going to be 2N, meaning it's diploid. So this is your oogonia. This is the stem cell inside of the ovary that will divide to become your primary oocyte. So we would say it's 2N. It has half the genetic material from your mother, and it'll have half the genetic material from your mother, 2N. Now, of course it would replicate and you'd have crossing over. I'm not going to go over that. Now, your oogonia in your ovaries are going to start meiosis before you're ever born. So it starts to divide. Now, what it divides into is what we call our primary oocyte. Your primary oocyte is still also going to be a 2N, so I'm just going to write 2N right here. 2N diploid cell, meaning that it has half the chromosomes from your mother and half the chromosomes from your father. Now, this is very different from the female. Meiosis begins, but it stops, and it does not continue to divide or actually start its meiosis or finish meiosis until you get to puberty. So, it begins meiosis, but it stops, so it never really divides into a haploid cell. Now, when you hit puberty, your primary oocyte is going to divide. So this represents meiosis 1 still, and this is going to occur when you hit puberty. So at puberty, you're going to resume meiosis 1. When you resume meiosis 1, you're going to produce a haploid. We call this your secondary oocyte. And your secondary oocyte is going to be what's released into the fallopian tube or the uterine horn to basically wait to be fertilized. So this is what's released from the ovary in a process called ovulation. But when it divides, it actually produces a much smaller cell that is basically just waste, which we call the first polar body. So most of this is going to go to your secondary oocyte, and your first polar body is going to degenerate. So this is meiosis 1. The secondary oocyte is going to be what's released during ovulation. And it's going to wait to be fertilized. So this secondary oocyte will not resume meiosis 2 unless it's fertilized. So inside of the fallopian tube, your secondary oocyte, draw a little smaller because I'm running out of room, is going to wait to be fertilized by a sperm cell, which is also 1N. So you have your 1N sperm cell, and you have your secondary oocyte, which is released during ovulation. Just put here into the fallopian tube where it's going to wait for fertilization. The fallopian tube is part of the uterus, and you have your 1N secondary oocyte, and this is fertilization. When the 1N sperm and the 1N secondary oocyte are fused, that is called fertilization. And once fertilization occurs, this will actually undergo its second round of meiosis. Gonna have to run into my next paper because I ran out of room. So the fertilized secondary oocyte, once it's fertilized, will undergo meiosis 2, and it's gonna make its second polar body, which is gonna disintegrate, or basically goes away. It's nothing. And we're gonna have our fertilized ovum. A fertilized ovum is a fertilized egg, which is gonna travel to the uterus, and it's gonna basically be a zygote, or a baby that implants itself into the endometrium of the uterus. So another word for fertilized ovum, a single-celled organism that's going to undergo mitosis, is a zygote. Now, when you fertilize this fertilized ovum, this zygote, is now going to become a diploid, a 2N, because you have half the genetic material that's going to come from the sperm, and half the genetic material which comes from the egg. And your fertilized ovum, the zygote, is a new baby. So this is OOgenesis. Now all of OOgenesis is going to occur in the, well, not all of it, because some of it's released in the fallopian tube, but most of it's going to happen in the cortex of the ovary. So we have to talk a lot about the ovary cortex. Now I have some notes to take on here. We know that men can produce spermatogonia A and B, and that's why they can produce children until they're 90 years old, 100 years old. They constantly replace our stem cells. Now, as far as primary oocytes go, meiosis begins before birth, but it stops. So, at birth, you have 2 to 4 million primary oocytes before birth. 2 to 4 million before birth. So all of our primary oocytes are produced before we're ever born. Guys, on the other hand, continue to reproduce their stem cells. Spermatogonia A divides to spermatogonia B, and they have a lifelong supply of stem cells. We, on the other hand, only have so many that we produce. So we have 2 to 4 million before birth. By the time we reach puberty, some of our primary oocytes are going to die off. So at puberty, you have 80 to 40,000 primary oocytes at puberty. And then once you hit puberty, you'll release anywhere from 20 to 30, you will mature 20 to 30 different eggs, but you will only release one egg into the fallopian tube. So over your life, of the time that you start your period until you hit menopause, you will release 400 to 500 secondary oocytes during ovulation. And this is going to go from puberty until you hit menopause. Now, every month, this is part of the ovarian cycle, every month you have 20 to 30 primary oocytes that are going to mature into secondary oocytes, but only one is going to be released during ovulation. If you had multiple released during ovulation, that's how you would end up with twins. If you talk about fertility drugs, you're trying to increase the amount of eggs that you release during ovulation. And that's one of the things that fertility drugs is going to do. So 400 to 500 are released from the time you hit puberty until you hit menopause when you quit releasing these. But only one technically is released during ovulation, even though 20 to 30 are going to mature in the ovary. But only one will make it for ovulation. So what I need to go over is the ovary, which is the primary sex organ of the female. So when we look at an ovary, there's a lot that's going on with the ovary. All right, the ovary is round, just like the testes is round. Now, the very center portion of the ovary is going to be called the ovary medulla. So, the center portion is going to be the medulla. Your medulla is mostly going to have your blood vessels, your lymphatic vessels. There's other things that we talk about with a medulla, but basically when you look at the ovary, we have to talk about the ovarian cortex. So the cortex is always the outer layer. So for our ovarian cortex, this is going to be the site of oogenesis. And when we talked about the male, we talked about the testes, it would be called the seminiferous tubules. So in the cortex of the ovary, where we have oogenesis, we're going to have follicles. So the site of oogenesis occurs in the ovarian cortex inside of follicles. So we're going to talk about different types of follicles. So we're going to have a lot bigger pictures than these, but basically you're going to have follicles, and these are going to store your primary oocytes. So your primary oocytes are literally, there's going to be around 80 to 40,000 of these that are going to be in your ovarian cortex and these follicles. So this right here represents a follicle. Inside of it is your primary oocyte. I know this is going to be hard to read. I'll zoom in on it here in a moment. Now, follicles are literally going to grow in size, which I'm going to discuss. So there is 80 to 40,000 of these follicles. Now, whenever we talk about the hypothalamus, your hypothalamus is going to produce a hormone at puberty called gonadotropic releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to release FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, which is going to stimulate the follicle to grow. So the follicles are going to grow in size. And eventually, I'm just going to draw this over here, over the time it grows, it's going to be this huge follicle, and that follicle is going to release your secondary oocyte. This is a process called ovulation. Ovulation releases your secondary oocyte, which is this one right here. Which is going to get fertilized in the fallopian tube but we have to have a process. Things are gonna have to happen. So your follicle has to grow. So this is gonna be one of our follicles, which we call a secondary follicle because there's other ones that are involved. And then basically you're gonna have your secondary oocyte that has to be released. So the hormone that stimulates ovulation is gonna come from the anterior pituitary, luteinizing hormone, which is gonna stimulate the mature follicle to release the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube. So FSH and LH are from the anterior pituitary. Gonadotropic releasing hormone is from the hypothalamus. Now, before I can go over the ovary, you have to understand that the site of oogenesis occurs within follicles. So the follicles are key to understand follicle stimulating hormone. So these follicles are gonna grow. When you have follicle stimulating hormone, it stimulates it to become mature. So this is gonna basically be a pre-ovulatory follicle. It grows really large in size. And then something else triggers the release of LH and ovulation is gonna occur. So when we talk about the ovary, the most important thing for oogenesis is that you understand that the cortex is the site of oogenesis, which occurs in follicles. And then the next point is to understand that follicles are gonna develop and mature with the oocyte. Now, we started with oogonia. So, I have to start with oogonia before birth because meiosis begins but stops and creates the primary oocyte. So when we talk about before birth, the follicles are called primordial follicles. The very first follicle that you have is gonna be called a primordial follicle. Now, this is gonna be a really big picture. I wish I could turn it on its side and go through and talk about it like this, but you wouldn't be able to see it very easy. So I'm gonna start with one. I'm gonna draw it large, and then I'm gonna work my way up, and then I would tell you to take that same information and condense it to one page. So we're gonna talk about the first follicle. Again, this is before birth. I'm gonna go over follicles. So the first follicle that you have before your meiosis begins is called a primordial follicle. So we're going over the development and maturing of the oocyte in the follicles. So you have basically squamous cells. Squamous cells means that they're flat. Now I'm drawing this kind of large because I'm going to use this page to describe the follicle development. So we're talking the ovary cortex. So on the outside of your follicle, these right here are called follicular cells. That's pretty easy to remember. Follicular cells are going to make up the follicle. Now inside of your follicle is going to be your primary oocyte. So your oogonia start meiosis, and this represents your primary oocyte. So if we were talking about before birth, you're going to have 2 to 4 million before birth. And these are all the follicles inside of the ovarian cortex. Now, the name of this follicle with the primary oocyte and the follicular cells before birth is called your primordial follicle. The follicles that contain your primary oocytes, this is before birth. These develop before birth. Now, once you're born, your primordial follicle is going to change until you reach puberty. So your primordial follicle from birth to childhood changes just a little bit. So my arrow represents over time. So the next one is called a primary follicle. This is how it grows from the time you're born until you're a child. Now, the follicular cells become square or cuboidal. That's a cuboidal cell. So I'm just gonna draw them a little bigger. I'm not gonna draw them as cuboidal cells. I'm just gonna draw them as larger. So follicular cells, these are squamous, they're flat. So these are gonna be a little bit bigger. So I'm just gonna draw them as circles. They get larger. The follicular cells enlarge. So we'd no longer call them follicular cells because they're a little bit bigger. Instead, the follicular cells become granulosa cells. Now, one important thing when we talk about granulosa cells are going to be what's responsible for producing estrogen in females, or androgens, which are converted into estrogen. So these, I'm going to write out here, are going to secrete estrogen, and that will be important when we talk about the ovarian cycle. And anytime you say estrogen, of course, secondary sexual characteristics, but anytime we produce estrogen, it's going to make the uterus, the endometrium lining, get thicker whenever we're trying to prepare for pregnancy. We'll talk a lot about that, but right now just know granulosa cells secrete estrogen, and estrogen is the hormone made by the females in the ovary. Now, another structure is going to form. Now we still have our primary oocyte, so the primary oocyte is still there. You can label that. But a thin layer of glycoprotein is going to develop around the primary oocyte. So when we talked about sperm went to the epididymis where we had glycogen so that the sperm could basically mature. So think of this next layer as a glycoprotein, which allows for the primary oocyte to mature as a child. So this right here is known as the zona pellucida. The zona pellucida is going to be a layer of glycoprotein that surrounds the primary oocyte. So this is new. So this line represents before birth. So this is going to represent growth. However, this is only going to occur until childhood. This is the next follicle, which we call our primary follicle. So your primary follicle is going to be developed through childhood. So at childhood, your follicular cells become granulosal cells, which are going to secrete estrogen. Your primary oocyte is still there. Your follicle's growing, and your zona pellucida is going to form. Now, this has to change once you meet puberty. So at puberty, you start getting hormones that are going to make the follicle grow. So the next one, I would draw an arrow, but I'm trying to draw it large enough so that you can see it, is going to be what we call our secondary follicle. So it's going to look very similar, except for your follicle is going to start to grow even bigger, so you need more follicular cells. Your granulosal cells are going to start to divide. So I'm going to leave a little space at the top. The follicle is growing. Your granulosal cells are going to grow more. So this is at puberty. At puberty, your primary follicle divides into the secondary follicle. Now I could ask you, which hormone makes your follicle grow? The answer would be follicle stimulating hormone. Where is it from? From the anterior pituitary. So all of these are still granulosal cells. Granulosal cells are going to produce estrogen. So what happens is at puberty, gonadotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release follicle stimulating hormone, which acts on the follicle to make your granulosal cells, which were originally called follicle cells, to grow. So it grew. So this is going to be at puberty. Now, our primary oocyte is still there. That's still our primary oocyte. We still have our zona pellucida, which is the layer of glycoprotein. Remember, it is the layer of glycoprotein. So we can still say we have our zona pellucida. Now, something is very important about these granulosal cells. If you double or triple or quadruple the amount of granulosal cells, you're going to also increase the amount of estrogen. This is very important. Estrogen is going to make the endometrial lining of the uterus to thicken. So you're starting to basically get ready for puberty. So this is puberty happening. At puberty, we know that when you undergo meiosis 1, you finish it when you hit puberty. So we talked about that. At puberty, you resume meiosis 1. So your primary oocyte is going to divide into a secondary oocyte. But you have to remember that your follicles grow with your primary oocyte. So at puberty, you release gonadotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates follicle stimulating hormone, which makes the follicular cells, which we now call granulosal cells, produce a lot of estrogen. So at puberty is whenever we produce these. So we call this your secondary follicle, but this is only at puberty when you're granulosal cells. So we can label this. This is your secondary follicle. It grew from your primary follicle. However, on this one, we have to know that your puberty is going to now resume meiosis 1. So your primary oocyte is going to divide into your secondary oocyte and your first polar body. Now, I'm going over the follicle, so we're going to change the name of the primary oocyte inside of the follicle to your secondary follicle. So, literally, we can draw two little lines like this. Over here, you're going to have your first polar body. your first polar body is just gonna basically disintegrate. Nothing really happens with this. So this is your first polar body. Nothing happens with that. So it kind of comes off here over on the side, but most of the granulosal cells are gonna continue to surround now the secondary oocyte, because this is where meiosis occurs. So this is gonna be meiosis 1, continues. So your follicles, your FSH is still gonna be produced. So you have 20 to 30 eggs every ovarian cycle that are gonna basically start to divide, but only one is gonna be released. So we have a really large follicle now because of FSH. So you have to draw this really large. It's grown in size. It has even more layers of granulosal cells. Which means lots and lots and lots of estrogen, which is making the endometrium lining very thick. High amounts of estrogen make you crazy right before you're about to start your period. This is where you get cranky. Lots of granulosal cells, lots of estrogen going on here. Now, this right here is now what we call your pre-ovulatory follicle. It's also got the name of a mature follicle. It also has the name of a Graafian follicle. So at puberty, it starts to grow. Now, we do know that meiosis 1 occurs, so instead of calling this the primary oocyte, now it is considered to be your secondary oocyte because meiosis occurred. The secondary oocyte still has the zona pellucida surrounding it. Remember, that's the nutrient source. I misspelled it up here, CIDA. That's a layer of glycoprotein. Now, the layer of granulosal cells that surround the secondary oocyte, just these right here, and I'm just highlighting them. This right here is going to be known as the corona radiata. These are granulosal cells that when the secondary oocyte is released, these are going to get released with the secondary oocyte. Now the sperm cell has to eat through all the corona radiata and the glycoprotein to fertilize the egg. So these cells that are right here, that are granulosal cells, are called the corona radiata. Now, another thing happens. This right here, and technically this happens in your secondary follicle, is you start to have what we call follicular fluid that's developing everywhere. So you have all this fluid that's like really just kind of pooling. We call this follicular fluid. The marker needs to be thrown away. So this area of the follicle is filled with follicular fluid. A large amount of fluid. So this area with this large amount of fluid is called the antrum. Your antrum is a large cavity filled with follicular fluid. Since it's growing, it's a developing fluid. So up here you could put follicular fluid. Follicular fluid is going to develop at puberty, but by the time you're ready to ovulate your secondary oocyte, it's huge. Now, the name of this follicle, it has 3 names. Well, maybe 4 names. It is called, and I'm ran out of room, so I'll just put it underneath. This is called your vesicular follicle. Vesicular means a lot of fluid, so basically that's the vesicle portion. It contains a lot of follicles. It's also known as the Graafian follicle. I'm guessing the scientist that discovered it in the ovary. It's also called the tertiary follicle, so secondary to now tertiary. Tertiary means the third, but it's also called pre-ovulatory follicle. It has 4 names. So, when we talk about the granulosal cells, and this is going to be important, you have a ton of granulosa cells. So, your granulosal cells are producing now so much estrogen. I'm going to put estrogen. 3 should be enough. Estrogen. High levels of estrogen are going to stimulate you to produce luteinizing hormone. So luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate the release of the secondary oocyte from the ovary. High amounts of estrogen is going to stimulate luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary, which is going to make you ovulate. So that's why we call this pre-ovulation, pre-ovulatory follicle. So LH causes ovulation, and ovulation is literally the release of the secondary oocyte from the ovary. So FSH from puberty is making the follicle grow. And when you have high amounts of estrogen, when you get to the vesicular follicle, high amounts of estrogen stimulates the anterior pituitary to release LH. The ovary then is going to release the secondary oocyte from the ovary and into the fallopian tube. So we've seen the ovarian cortex. It grows. So we started with the primordial follicle to the primary follicle to the secondary follicle. Now we're to the pre-ovulatory follicle. Now, we're going to continue with the follicle and what's going on in the ovary, because this doesn't leave, the follicle does not leave the ovary, but it continues to become something else. So, inside of the cortex, after ovulation, this is going to stay, and it's going to become what we call the corpus luteum. And in the ovarian cycle, it'll eventually become a scar tissue known as the corpus albicans. So, ovulation is what we're doing now. So, we're on to the release of the secondary oocyte. So, let's see. On this one, here's my ovary. Your pre-ovulatory follicle is going to go to the edge of the ovarian cortex, and blister. Now, some of your follicular fluid from your antrum, some of it is going to exit. But primarily during ovulation, you're releasing your secondary oocyte. So it's important to know that the granulosal cells surrounding the secondary oocyte are known as corona radiata. You still have the zona pellucida, which is the layer of glycoprotein. But now we're calling this the secondary oocyte. Now, out here, the fimbriae, the little fingers of the fallopian tube, are going to pick up the secondary oocyte, and it's going to go into the fallopian tube and wait to be fertilized. So, right here, fimbriae, pick up the secondary oocyte, it travels to the fallopian tube. Now this is the fallopian tube. And it is going to wait for fertilization. Remember, if fertilization occurs, this is when meiosis II occurs. But you still need to know all the names of these things. So, you have your granulosal cells. What does your granulosal cells produce? Estrogen. You have your antrum with follicular fluid. You have your zona pellucida, which is a layer of glycoprotein. I can't talk today. We know that this is your secondary oocyte. It's going to wait to be fertilized. However, the cells surrounding the secondary oocyte are called corona radiata, and that's what the sperm has to eat through in order to fertilize the secondary oocyte with its acrosome that has hyaluronidase, the enzyme that eats through the corona radiata and the zona pellucida basically to fertilize this egg. Now, we're talking about the follicle. So, ovulation occurs. High levels of estrogen stimulates the release of luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary onto the pre-ovulatory follicle. So this is ovulation. However, we're talking about what happens to the pre-ovulatory follicle. So, your pre-ovulatory follicle now is a little different. It makes a different shape completely. The granulosal cells are still there. However, they change. So these are my granulosal cells. They change. So we don't call them the follicle anymore, but it almost appears to have a yellow color. So the color or the word for yellow in the body is luteum. So this is after ovulation. after ovulation, the pre-ovulatory follicle changes. Now this does change inside of the ovary. This is literally just going to become the next step. It becomes yellow. And what we call this is called the corpus for body that is going to remain inside of the ovary. It's yellow. It's called the corpus luteum. This is the corpus luteum. It's a body that's yellow. Luteum means yellow. Now the corpus luteum is very important because we know that the secondary oocyte is waiting for fertilization. So we have a secondary hormone that's going to help continue to grow the endometrium of the uterus. So the corpus luteum is only going to persist if fertilization occurs. For a couple of days, it's going to stay though. Now, what it's going to do is it's going to produce progesterone. Now, progestation. Progesterone literally means for pregnancy. Gestation is pregnancy. Progesterone. So our granulosal cells produce estrogen. Your corpus luteum is going to produce progesterone. Now, progesterone is literally going to start making the inside of the uterus get thick, because if fertilization occurs, then the secondary oocyte, once it's fertilized, the ovum has to bury itself inside of the uterine lining. So this literally is going to make the endometrium, which is the inner layer of the uterus, it thickens. Now the same thing happens with estrogen. Estrogen also helps the endometrium thicken, but after ovulation, progesterone is going to make it even thicken more, and it's going to produce a substance called uterine milk in case pregnancy occurs. Uterine milk, a glycogen-rich fluid to feed the ovum. And again, an ovum is literally the secondary oocyte that's been fertilized. So the corpus luteum is trying to get ready for pregnancy. So every time you ovulate, your body thinks you're going to get pregnant. So this has to happen every time. So now, say a couple days passes, no fertilization occurs. Well, we don't need progesterone anymore. So the corpus luteum disintegrates, starts to shrink. It's like, oh man, no pregnancy didn't occur. So this is when you start getting sad. Your body literally starts to feel sad, and you're like, oh, I didn't get pregnant. Now you don't really think that. You might really be like, yay, I didn't get pregnant. But for whatever reason, sometimes we get sad. So if fertilization doesn't occur, you start to decrease your progesterone, and your body literally starts to get sad. But this is only going to last for a couple of days. So if no fertilization occurs, there's no need for the corpus luteum. So your corpus luteum then shrinks, and it turns a white color. So it's small now. So the word for white in the body is albic, albicans, albino. So your corpus luteum becomes the corpus albican. Corpus means body. Albino means white, so albican. So this is literally the corpus luteum when it shrinks, but it's white now. So no fertilization occurs. So this is scar tissue in the ovary from your beginning follicle, from your secondary follicle all the way to your pre-ovulatory follicle to the corpus luteum. So now you have scar tissue, and this occurs about day 28. So when we do all the different cycles, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, you're going to have to know what's going on inside of the ovary. So literally, you stop producing progesterone. So this is where you start being sad. You know pregnancy is not going to occur. Your body knows that pregnancy is not going to occur. So when you stop producing progesterone, then you have to get rid of all that endometrium. So this is literally gonna lead to menstruation, which is your period. You're gonna bleed, and you're gonna slough off the lining of the endometrium of the uterus. So when we talk about the ovary and everything that's going on, this is called the ovarian cycle. Releasing the egg, producing the corpus albicans. This is basically on a cycle from day 1 all the way to day 28. Your ovarian cycle is a 28-day cycle. This whole process in the ovary takes 28 days. So we can go through and look at it from the very beginning. First, you need to start with OOgenesis. OOgenesis is oogonia. You make your primary oocyte, which is going to stop. At birth, you have 2 to 4 million. At puberty, you have 80 to 40,000. So your primary oocyte is in follicles in the ovarian cortex, and you have to divide to your secondary oocyte. Your secondary oocyte is released during ovulation into the fallopian tube, and that's when meiosis 2 is going to occur. But remember, your fertilized ovum has to implant into the uterus, so we really need to understand the ovarian cycle. You really need to understand the ovarian cycle. The full on, where did my paper go? Here it is. The ovarian cycle, the full month. What's going on? So we really need to understand the follicles. So when we say ovarian cycle, basically this is one time a month, one time monthly, from puberty until you reach menopause. You're going to have follicles, they're going to grow, you're going to ovulate, and you're going to produce scar tissues. This is going to be a 28-day cycle. I can write the whole entire ovarian cycle by understanding the follicles. Now, primordial follicles before birth, primary follicle is at childhood. Where it all starts is your secondary follicle. So at puberty, so this would be literally every month, your secondary follicle would be day 1. Day 1 of the basically ovarian cycle. So when your follicle stimulating hormone makes the granulosal cells grow, this is what we call the follicular phase. Of the ovarian cycle. So you produce FSH one time a month. So this would be day 1. And then you get to ovulation. So this is going to be halfway through the cycle. So to day 1 to day 14, you grow this really large follicle. So at day 14, this is when you ovulate. Ovulation is day 14. Now, the luteal phase, when you produce the corpus luteum, that's the next phase. So you have the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. It's basically day 14 to day 28. It's a 28-day cycle. So if nothing occurs at day 28 of the ovarian cycle, so you could even literally draw this right here, corpus luteum, and then you could go up here, corpus albicans. The very last phase is going to lead to menstruation. So in the ovarian cycle, you have menstruation, which is going to be when you stop producing progesterone at day 28. So that is the full entire what's going on in the ovary, but we have to understand it's a one-time monthly 28-day cycle where you produce the corpus albicans. But it's important to understand the uterine cycle as well, which is growing the endometrium, preparing for the baby, and that is going to occur with your hormones, estrogen. So already the uterus is pretty thick by the time you get to day 14. And then you're going to have progesterone, which is going to make the endometrium even thicker from the corpus luteum. But then at day 28, no more progesterone. So your uterine cycle, you're going to have menstruation, which is part of the uterine cycle, where you basically slough it off. So I'll do the uterine cycle really quickly. So if we understand the uterine cycle, let me grab a new piece of paper. The uterine cycle basically is discussing what's going on in the uterus compared to the ovarian cycle. If you understand the ovarian cycle, the uterine cycle is easy. So estrogen and progesterone are going to make the uterus grow. Estrogen is always going to come from your granulosal cells. Progesterone is going to come from the corpus luteum. These are coming from the ovary. But the uterine cycle relies on estrogen and progesterone to thicken the endometrium to prepare for pregnancy. So we have 3 cycles of the uterine cycle. The first one is going to basically be menstruation. You have to get rid of everything before you can start everything. So we're also going to have a secretory phase where we're producing uterine milk. And then you're going to have a pre-ovulation phase. So for the uterine cycle, menstruation for the uterus is going to happen from day 1 to day 5. Basically, you have a period. Pre-ovulation phase or proliferative phase is with estrogen. It occurs from day 6 to day 14. This is because you have your granulosal cells producing high amounts of estrogen. So it starts to grow rapidly, but then you have the secretory phase where it's producing uterine milk. And the only way we can make uterine milk is progesterone. And progesterone is going to come from the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is most active basically at day 14 to day 28. So your secretory phase is happening at the same time as the luteal phase. Basically, it's day 15 to day 28. And when that day 28 is over, you start your period, which is menstruation, day 1 to day 5. So it always goes back to the ovarian cycle, and if you understand the ovarian cycle, you can understand the uterine cycle. You could write these on your phases, but menstruation, we already know, is when you produce the corpus albicans. Corpus albicans is scar tissue. No progesterone anymore. Pre-ovulatory phase, your granulosa cells produces estrogen. Day 14 is ovulation. So pre-ovulation, so it stops at day 14. Secretory phase, the uterus is making a glycogen-rich fluid to feed the ovum. So this is the last phase, and it ends with the corpus luteal phase, and when the corpus albicans phase is going to take over. That's the uterine cycle. If you know the ovarian cycle, you pretty much know the uterine cycle. So that's the end of our video.